My name is Pat Wilds. I'm the relatively new director here of the Government Law Center at Albany Law School. Graduated here in 2016, and it's really great to be back. Um, the GLC has been around for well over 40 years, offering really innovative and exciting programming like this, and obviously doing a lot to prepare our students to be the next generation of government lawyers and leaders. So thank you for joining us and being a part of our programming. A little bit about this specific programming set, and then I'll turn it over to Chell and we'll get underway. Um, the Warren Anderson series has been around for a significant number of years. It takes place monthly during the spring between February and May, offering hour-long programs focusing on key issues in front of the state legislature during the session, and of course, right now during the budget. The series is named in honor of Warren M. Anderson, an Albany Law alumni from the class of 1940, who served in the state Senate for 36 years, working alongside six different governors. He was the longest serving majority leader of the Senate, holding that position from 1973 to 1988. And of course, the goal of these programs, us being a nonpartisan entity here, is really to explain and promote dialogue and educate folks on key policy issues and key legal issues that are really pressing in our society. And just quickly before I introduce our panelists, I want to acknowledge and say thank you to our generous sponsor today of the Anderson series. And that's a contribution made in memory of Sharon P. O'Connor, Esquire, who is an Albany Law grad from the class of 1979. So we're really thankful for that support today. Joining us today to discuss really key and pressing issues in, K through 12 education are our moderator, Kyle Belokopitsky, class of 2005 from Albany Law School. So Kyle, thank you for joining us and thanks for being part of the law school family. Bob Megna, president of the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Marina Marcou-O'Malley, co-executive director of the Alliance for Quality Education. Sean Giambattista, director of state aid at the New York State Education Department. And Alethea Rodriguez Rolón, legislative director at New York State United Teachers. I'll pass it over to Chell, who's really been instrumental in pulling today's program together. So all the credit for all the behind the scenes work goes to her. So Chell.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of logistical items to get out of the way before we get started with content. As many of you know, today there's one professional practice continuing legal education credit for attorneys based in New York who are attending this program. The CLE forms and materials have been sent to you by email. Please complete and sign your CLE forms and submit them by email to our colleague Lisa Rivage within 24 hours after the program. You will get a follow-up email and I'll add some text in the chat for you. If you have any questions about CLE credit, please email Lisa. As you will see, American Sign Language interpretation is available for this program. We also have live automated captions. To see the captions, you'll click View Captions at the bottom of your Zoom window. Today, we are also recording the program for future viewing. We will circulate the link after the program. Finally, if you have questions for our speakers, we'll use the Q&A tool here. So click the Q&A button at the bottom of your window and type in your question. We will monitor questions throughout and open up for Q&A at the end of the discussion. And with that, I am happy to pass things over to Kyle.
Jill, thanks so much for having us all this morning, and good afternoon. I'm sure you're watching from snowy Albany or Buffalo or Long Island. I think the whole state's under some type of storm warning. So thanks for being here really to talk about what's most important to our schools, our educators, and as always on PTA's mind, our children, because we all know they're the most important people in those school buildings. Thanks to all of my colleagues from our fantastic institutions, our schools, our community organizations for being here today. We're going to jump right in because we have limited time. And I really want to dig in with our panelists because they bring such a wealth of knowledge this morning. Governor Hochul really did a lot in her budget, both in terms of funding and in programmatic initiatives. I'm going to first ask Alethea and Marina and then Bob and Sean, what is really one educational P-12 issue in New York State in the budget or outside of the budget process this season, in this legislative season, that your organizations are looking for? Alethea, Marina, what is those top two issues? What are you doing on those issues? And then I'm going to go to Bob and Sean.
Sure. So I'll get started. It's hard to say one issue because there are so many that we track, but
I know, maybe give me two if you
I
if
will,
you're
I
sure.
will. Universal School Meals Foundation Aid.
Yeah, those are fantastic. And I know we're going to talk about those in
Cell
more
phone,
depth with
right.
everyone. So I appreciate those. I know they really are a priority, I think, of everyone on this call. Marina?
I would say foundation aid for sure is the top issue for us in the education budget. But feeding every child in our schools is also very important. So we're happy about that.
And I'm hearing common theme, ladies. I think we would probably name those two issues as well as some of our two on behalf of PTA. Sean, Bob, I know you are some of our biggest foundation aid gurus in the state. Bob, you have a long history working for government and with DOB. Sean, obviously you are the state aid expert at SED. Bob, what are you seeing in this budget? What is the, what is your, what are you looking for?
Well, I don't know what I'm looking for. I think in the end, what I'd like to see are some of the pieces that people can come together on that we talked about in our foundation aid study. I think the way we did the study, we did it in such a way as to kind of break it into pieces so people could look at different aspects of the formula, see what might be ripe for reform now as we move on. So we're obviously interested in that. And I think, you see it in interest. The governor included a few pieces in her budget. And I think we've been talking to some of the legislative people about a few of the other pieces in a very complicated network of pieces that go into the foundation aid formula.
And I think that's fair, Bob. And we're going to dig in a little bit on the foundation aid formula to everybody watching. Sean, I want you to talk a little bit about foundation aid formula 101, right? It's exceptionally complicated. How our schools are funded by state aid and state funding is exceptionally complicated to lay people. And it's exceptionally complicated even to us in education policy. So give us a 101 on how that works.
Style. Foundation aid is complicated in its particulars, but I think the general concept is not overly complicated. My joke whenever I hear in public space that you have to be a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon to work on this kind of thing is I go to my team and I say, "Did you know you're all rocket scientists?" And we have a good laugh about that. But foundation aid is really four moving pieces. So we start with what's called the foundation amount. That's the amount that was identified on the successful schools study. That's like, how much money does a district need to spend on a per pupil basis to support general education and be successful? And it's less normative and more, how much do successful schools actually spend on a per pupil basis? And we start with that as kind of our seed. From that, the formula adjusts for the student needs in different districts. We know that different districts face a lot of different challenges, and that the student populations, vary widely. We have a very mixed state with a lot of, small districts and the largest district in the country. We have, wealthy districts. We have districts with really a lot of need. There's a lot of variety. So the first adjustment is student need. And that's reflected with a couple of pieces. Some of them are related to the student's economic situation. Are they being raised in a family that is struggling with poverty? Are they eligible currently for a free or reduced price lunch, which is based on a percentage of that poverty threshold? Are they an English language learner, right? So there's a couple of measures of student need. The next piece, so that's piece number one, or adjustment number one. The next adjustment is for regional cost differences. We know that hiring a teacher doesn't cost the same everywhere in the state. We know that paying for building costs isn't the same everywhere in the state. We know that cost of living is different. And so there's an adjustment for the regional costs that different regions in the state face. And that's the next, or the second moving part in foundation aid. The third is a local share. So when you kind of put those three pieces together that we talked about previously, you get an amount per pupil, and then there's a division of that amount between state responsibility and local responsibility. And so the local share is based on how much income does a school district have within its region, right? How much property value is there within the region? How much of that is that on a per pupil basis versus an aggregate basis? And so from there, we do a division. It's typically done with what's called a state sharing ratio, which is, we put in some numbers and we say, your district should be 75% funded by the state and 25% by your local revenue, or whatever the range is. The range currently goes up through 91% is the maximum the state will support. And we'll talk about that maximum as we get to the governor's proposal. The very last piece is, once you've done all that, you have a per pupil amount that the state is going to fund for a school district, and you have to multiply that by a number of students. And it's not just an enrollment basis, because we realize that the formula realizes that different students have, again, different needs. And so there's a weight for students with disabilities. There's a weight for students who are recently declassified. There's a weight for summer school students. There's some other kinds of pieces in there to reflect, that it's not just an enrollment basis, but it's a broader look at the number of students that a district is serving. All of that together produces that formula amount that leads to the largest aid formula and the largest amount of aid that the state pays to school districts.
And I think that's fantastic, Sean. And I know we'll have more materials available. You can also find more materials in many of our association's websites and SCD and at the Rockefeller Institute on how the formula actually works. Bob, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the governor's changes she did to this foundation aid formula. You had recommended, the Rockefeller Institute had recommended 16 changes, if my memory serves me, to the foundation aid formula overall in some kind of a capacity, or at least 16 things that could have been looked at. She chose to change 2 things in this budget. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, again, I mean, our approach when we were tasked in the middle of the night last year to take a look at the state aid formula was and the approach we took was to take and I agree that in essence, the formula is not complicated. But when you look at how the pieces interact and the other kind of constraints we've put on those pieces to make the formula work, that's where it gets complicated. I mean, the base itself, not that complicated, but the way we've defined these pieces, I think, is where the trouble starts. And obviously quite honestly, the politics of this start. I mean, to abstract from that totally, I think, would be to not tell the full story. So, for example, one of the things we looked at that I do not believe the governor chose to look at too extensively was something that was already mentioned that sounds simple in practice, which is cost of living. Yeah, it's not simple when you try to figure out how should a region be defined? How should the index be calculated? How should it be allocated? Especially when you may think that the current definitions aren't appropriate. And so I think with the formula, the way I look at it and the boxes is that those choices that have to be made by folks about how you want to do something that's even very simple in concept, which is change the cost of living. I think the governor picked a few relatively simple pieces that she decided with her staff that they thought made sense in attacking the formula this year. I think people, again, ignoring the political side of this can be difficult. Often I think governors feel they are held accountable for changes that are being proposed in the formula in ways that are different than how they thought they proposed them, for example, which I think may have been part of the impetus for our study. So I think she picked up 2 of the relatively smaller pieces that we looked at to include in her budget. But other than that, I think she took a pretty plain vanilla approach to how she wanted to treat school aid this year, vis-a-vis prior years.
And I think that's a great segue into Alethea and Marina. Let's talk a little bit about priorities in that foundation aid funding. I know many of us in the education stakeholder side have priorities from PTA. Of course, we want to see funding for CT, BOCES, students with disabilities, English language learners, school meals, etc. So what are some of your associations and organizations' priorities in foundation aid? And then I also want to talk a little bit about what Safe Harmless means. And Sean, I want you to hit on that 2% minimum she did. So Alethea, Marina.
Marina, go ahead first.
Okay, thanks, Alethea. AQE has had a long list of priorities in the foundation aid formula. We publicized those a couple of years ago, and those remain as things that we would like to see change, from how we calculate the base allocation amount that Sean spoke about, like how we define what is successful, how much does it cost to educate a typically developing student so they're successful. All of that remain priorities, remain things that we want to see change in the formula. However, as Bob mentioned, we are in a legislative year in the budget cycle, and within state politics, the governor's proposal gives us a framework that we need to, operate within, right? So we want to see the changes that the governor proposed in her budget on poverty measures, on the 2 poverty measures, are absolutely things that need to be changed, right? With the way we calculate poverty, should not be based in 2000 census, like we're in 2025, sorely outdated. The Board of Regents put out the same proposal around updating measures, and we support those. However, one other thing that needs to happen for the foundation aid formula, since we cannot and we probably won't get it in the budget this year, on overhauling how we define successful schools and a successful student and the cost for that, is really updating the regional cost index and how we calculate it so that it more accurately reflects cost in each region. In 2025, things have changed a great deal since the formula was created and implemented, and we need to account for that. And then in addition, for the foundation aid formula, some of these changes have a negative impact. For instance, the small area income and poverty estimate will have a negative impact on what New York City can expect. But it's not only New York City, it's actually 24 school districts, 16 of them are high needs. So we need to make sure that those school districts are actually not impacted negatively by this change in the formula. We need to think specifically about those locations. The regional cost index will recapture some of that money that they can expect, or that they were expecting under current law, and they're currently under the executive proposal will not get. But we need to think about those specifically.
And I'll add growth aid. So when districts get a surge in enrollment, as they have in the past couple of years, being able for them to get that money now versus getting it a year later. Funding to ensure that students are getting, for our L students, that they're getting the intervention and services they need to help them learn English language and be able to accommodate themselves. Also with that special education. So that's another thing, not looking at special education services as being funded with $1 amount, because we know there's a spectrum of services depending on the student's disability or their needs. So those are the issues that we're looking at.
And I think PTA would agree with both of you. As you know, we align a lot of those issues. I know something that we all will agree, and I think SED as well, and I know Bob too, would be student mental health. I think that's something that I know SED has been working very strongly with the Office of Mental Health, and I know Nelson Rockefeller, thank you, Bob, is really focused on improving student mental health as well in many of your series, and certainly a priority of AQE and NYSED and PTA and the other educational stakeholders on the Educational Conference Board, rural schools, really everyone in that space. Sean, talk to me a little bit about the number. So everybody seemed pleased about the number. It was a $1.7 billion school aid increase. So there was a lot of happy faces sitting at the budget hearing table. That was the number that we kind of expected, right? According to formula, according to the number running. And talk to me a little bit about that minimum that she did put in there because some formula things were tweaked.
Thanks, Kyle. So New York State has a long history of what's sometimes called save harmless or hold harmless, which is that operating aid doesn't decrease from year to year. So if a district is receiving $10 one year, the following year, if the formula goes down and says, really the formula is generating 8, for purposes of stability and predictability, that district is held harmless at 10, right? In the last couple of years, we have seen some discussion about whether that safe harmless makes sense as state policy. This proposed executive budget maintains that safe harmless to ensure that all districts have at least level funding. But on top of that, the governor proposed a 2% minimum increase for all school districts. So the way that would work is we run the formula, and if the formula generates more than a 2% increase, the school gets that. And if it generates less than a 2% increase, then the school gets a 2% increase to make sure that, we know that costs are not stagnant. We know that inflation continues to be a factor in school district budgets that's not insignificant. And so this 2% is a piece of that puzzle in trying to put together a budget on the school district side that meets all of their student needs.
And I think that's helpful, Sean. And this is not the first time we have seen a set minimum in the executive proposal. So this seems to be common in the past years. Bob, I want you to talk a little bit, and we're going to then move off foundation aid, about the process. You have been a part of that process when you've been in state government for a very long time with the division of budget in your past hats. What happens next? So what do we have this executive budget. All of the stakeholders have testified. The Commissioner of Education has testified. And now it's in the legislature's hand. What happens?
Yeah, look, I think every year is different, that's for sure. But I think the basic procedures are the same. I think the legislature now each house will put out their one house proposals, and they're just that, they're proposals, right? Because they really can't issue actual bills until the executive budget is acted on. So they basically make proposals that talk about what their priorities might be different than the governor's priorities. So that has to happen now. Then in March, or the beginning of March, which we're getting to very quickly, it's a very rapid process, the legislature will come out and say whether they think there's more money available or less. They'll sit down with the executive. They'll negotiate a total amount of resource available for the budget. And that's when negotiations in the process really begin. And then over that month of March, and hopefully by April 1st, the parties can come together and agree on a final budget. School aid is always, it's at a minimum 25% of the state's budget. It is always at the core of the negotiations between the legislature and the executive on getting a budget done. And so it's lots of late nights for the folks at the legislature and the budget division, and even the state ed folks who help with the numbers to make sure we're calculating, or folks are calculating everything correctly. And there's a lot of back and forth. I think what you're going to see over the next week or two are the places where the legislature decides they'd like to tweak what the governor put in her budget. And again, those will be negotiated once they agree on an overall amount of revenue available for spending. I think they typically get to a conclusion pretty quickly on how they want to allocate that money across school districts. I think sometimes the past 2 years, I think, have been an example of that. The purely budget items get resolved relatively quickly. but they can't get done until all of the items get done. And sometimes there's overriding policy issues that might have nothing to do with education that could hold up the budget. And I think we've seen that a little bit the past few years. But in essence, that's the process.
I think that's a great summary. Thank you, Sean, and really for your expertise in this area, because it is a very complicated area. I want to talk a little bit about school meals, because this is a big ticket item, a priority for a lot of people in New York. So the Governor Hochul has fully funded in the state budget, the state's share of universal school meals, which would be $340 million. That is an increase of $160 million over and above last year's funding. What had happened, is a real quick summary, is that there's different buckets of funding for school meals. One is a free and reduced price lunch. That is what we call students who qualify under a federal nutrition program because they are in some level of poverty. And then there's something called community eligibility for school districts or school buildings themselves for free meals, because their students are in some level of poverty, and enough students are in some level of poverty that the school themselves can qualify. And then after that, we have the state can kind of kick in the funds. And that's what we're talking about now. So in October 2023, we had a change, positive change in our US government funding, where we had more community eligibility funding dollars come into New York and come into the country. So we saw a really great increase in the number of students under community eligibility that were able to have universal school meals. So here we are now. The governor has come up with the rest of the money. We are so thankful to her and to Senator Hinchey and Assemblywoman Rodriguez Rolas for all of the work that she has done. So Alethea, Marina, give me thoughts on school meals. What does that look like? And I'm going to pause here for a minute, Chell, because we have a CTLE, our CLE code we need to share for you lawyers like me who do need CLE credit. So let's do that code. And if you are a lawyer, you're going to need this code to fill out your CLE form.
Hello, our CLE code. You should see it on your screen. It is A, the letter A, 205. Attorneys, your CLE code is A, 205. Thank you.
Thank you, Cham. So again, thank you to Senators Hinchey and Assemblywoman Gonzalez Rojas. Alethea, Marina, talk to me about school meals, what's happening, and really what is happening in DC that may be affecting us now. So let's talk about that. Alethea, Marina.
Sure. Marina, go ahead. I'll let you go first.
Oh, I went first before. You go first now.
All right. So for our members, this has been a huge issue. We've been a part of the coalition along with AQE and with CHIO PTA to make this happen. So, our members see it firsthand, students coming to school hungry, and what that means for their ability to sit and learn. So right now, there's a lot of questions about what happens going forward with this expansion, right? Not sure what's going to happen. The funding at the federal level. So there's some fear and apprehension about being very excited about this expansion, but we are hopeful with our governor's leadership that we will be able to see this come to fruition.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of apprehension about how the federal context is going to affect this particular program, because many of our high-need school districts have been offering breakfast and lunch for a lot of years now, because they have such high levels of students in poverty and they see benefit from it. Like we all see the benefit from feeding students so they're better able to learn and make progress. And the fact of the matter is that even in school districts that are considered wealthy and affluent, there are still students and families who have trouble putting food on the table and depend on weekend programs or depend on local organizations for that. So it is a much welcome progress in our state to actually provide universal school meals and make sure that every kid has food so they're able to learn in school. The questions, the apprehension of the question around the funding, I mean, there are, I will sure hope that this is not going to be big sigh because I wish I could say that this program is not in jeopardy. The federal dollars are not in jeopardy, but we just don't know. The state can find the resources to step up and make sure that every child, every student doesn't go hungry in school. It is a matter of political will, and we are hoping that in this day and age, and with what's happening around us, that they are going to find that political will and make sure that they provide the funding if that is necessary, in addition to what is in the governor's budget right now, if that becomes necessary.
Any other thoughts on this?
Nope, just as Marina said, the need for children to be able to access food is not limited to certain schools, certain zip codes, certain neighborhoods in New York State. It's everywhere. We find it in the most wealthiest, affluent districts as well. So just wanted to stress that.
And I agree. I think one of the issues we deal with is stigma often in universal school meals. Senator Murray was recently from Long Island, was recently at our most recent press conference. And he had said he was a student and he shared his story that received free school meals. And he became embarrassed by having to use the free school meal ticket as a child. So he actually stopped eating lunch altogether in the school building because his friends, he got old enough and the friends at some point realized, well, he must have been the poor kid that used the free school meal ticket. So as a child, he stopped eating meals. I know my son came to me one day and in middle school, and he asked me, started to pack him an extra lunch. And I said, why, what's happening? And he said, this child doesn't often have enough to eat. And I always tear up when I think about feeding children. And I want to make sure that this child has enough food. So can you pack me extra food just to make sure that this child has enough? Jackson then went to high school and he came to me one day panicked. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, I don't know if my friend has food now because he's in high school. And it broke my heart that our children are worried about this. And then I realized that this is such a priority for us as parents and educators and stakeholders. I know Sean, SED is supportive, obviously, of making sure that every child has a healthy school meal. And Bob, I know, Rockefeller has been, fully in on this as well. So we are hoping to get this across the line. I say the day that a parent doesn't have to call me and my office and say, how do I get food to my child is going to be a day that we all win. Do we think it's going to happen? Do we think it's going to make the final budget? What is everybody's thoughts?
Yes, I think it's going to happen.
Yes.
I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Bob, what do you think? You've been around a long time in a good way.
If the governor proposed it, I don't see, given the climate that we're in right now, that anyone would reject, that the legislature would reject that notion, especially since many in the legislature have proposed similar things in the past. So I would think it would pass.
And Alethea, Marina, I know AQE and NICET and school boards and superintendents and principals. And I want to give a big shout out to our Hunger Solutions friends and our food advocate friends and Island friends and all of the advocates on the food hunger side, the school directors of lunch and the amazing people that have gone in to make this happen. So shout out to everybody. Another hot topic is cell phones in school buildings, as I'm sure. How many of us right now have a cell phone next to us? Don't be shy, like let's all admit it, right? Yeah, we all have our cell phones near us. And sometimes I think parents and families and adults are the worst modelers for our children. So we have to own that little bit too, as we all shake our head. We all work too much and sometimes we model really poor behavior for our kids. And we say this, my son reminds me all the time that I model poor behavior. So I try to do better, especially when I'm around him. Cell phones in schools, hot topic. It's in the budget. So who wants to talk to me about what she did in the budget?
I can go ahead and do that.
Great. Alethea, what do we have?
Sure. So in the budget, the governor has a proposal for distraction-free learning zones. This initiative is something that kind of comes off of the legislation that was enacted last year regarding algorithms and social media companies targeting our most vulnerable and the population, our youth. So after those bills were enacted, the governor started talking about cell phones. NICET also has been really engaged in this conversation. because our members are seeing firsthand the impacts of cell phone usage on students, right? They're distracted, they're not focused on school. Sometimes they get into some bullying situations by videotaping each other, sending it around. And also just they're not engaged, right? Our members tell us that in schools, you can hear a pin drop in between classes, at lunchroom. Instead of talking to each other, they're texting or they're on their phones. So in the budget, the governor has language and funding to also help implement this that would require school districts to come up with a policy providing for a bell-to-bell restriction. So that would mean that students would give in their cell phones up at the beginning of the day and then get it at the end of the day. There would be exemptions for medical reasons. Some students use it to track glucose, other things, also for translation services. And there's the caveat for principals or school administrators, teachers to allow students to use it for educational purposes. With that, the governor has put about $13.5 million so that way schools can purchase whatever devices to be able to facilitate the submitting in of the cell phones. So that is what the governor has. NYSET is excited to see this and is behind it. We've been highlighting this issue for a while. We did a big conference in September on this as well. So I'll be quiet and turn it over to anyone else.
Thanks, Alethea. Other thoughts on this topic?
I would add, so AQ's position is slightly different. We are not, I mean, we're not part of the campaign, but we are all for focusing on instruction and learning in school, right? And the tool and cell phones can be very distractive, and for sure be tools for bullying and the like. So so limiting access to that's probably okay. We've heard from some youth groups that we work with that they wanted to have a bigger voice in the conversation because they also have solutions to this. And so we think that oftentimes, and I'm not suggesting that this has happened, but oftentimes we adults tend to decide for young people without asking them. And we should absolutely, in this particular case, ask them and bring them to the table and engage. If we're going to have buy-in and make sure that this is going to work, we need to hear what they have to say. So that's one. And then the second thing is, in mental health is a really big issue in our schools, and I know you're all supported. And bullying existed prior to having cell phones in schools and is going to continue after if we do not take serious steps and if we do not make sure that we address the underlying causes of these kinds of behaviors that oftentimes extend outside of school and stem from outside of school, right? They're not only generated within the school building and because of what's happening in school. And then the third thing, when technology first came about, we were all very excited of how it can be incorporated in instruction or how it can be used to engage students more. And I think with everything that has happened over the last few years and with COVID pushing us to go all in on technology when we were not all exactly ready to do that. And not everybody had the training to do that. We sort of not going a step backwards and say, let's go back to face-to-face instruction or just leave things outside, which can be a good thing. But we should think about actually, now that we have the time, how we can incorporate more technology in a very productive way and in a way to engage the students more rather than outright rejecting them. And again, this is very nuanced. It's not about don't ban cell phones. That is not, like you said, Kyle, like Alethea said, we all model bad behavior. And yes, of course, it can be it can cause distractions in school for many students. Full disclosure, my high schooler says that she listens to music all day long at a high school because that helps her focus. She's a straight A student, so I can't actually argue with her. But that is one of the things that we have to consider, and I'm glad to hear that there are some exceptions in what is being proposed. But it's also one of the things that maybe students can bring to the table in a way that can make us think more globally around this.
It was interesting because I don't know if you saw yesterday, the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics released a study, and it kind of gave the governor's position a little bump. And I'm just going to read quickly from the study. It said that school students in the country are spending 1.5 hours on average during the school day. So that's between the bells, on their phones. So during instructional time, when they are in our classrooms and when they are in the hallways and when they should be in front of our fantastic educators, they are on their phones. 25% of students are actually spending more than 2 hours on their phones during the instructional day. And you know, it doesn't surprise me. It really doesn't surprise me. I had again, personal story. Jackson had texted me the other day during the school day, and I said, "Why are you texting me? I know it is not lunch period, and I know your cell phone's not supposed to be out. Don't text me until 3 o'clock." And I think it is a combination of they're so used to their phones, they can't get away from their phones. They want to miss not what's happening. We've talked to students. They are fearful that something is being said on social media about them, which goes into what you're saying, Marina, about the online bullying. And this, you know, really dovetails nicely into what we all did, many in the education space, which is last year's Safe Act for Kids, where, New York State passed laws to really regulate social media algorithms to try to remove those addicted feeds for students. So how do you think that fits in? So we know that our children are on social media a lot. We know that in New York State, we are trying to at least monitor that social media. We know many of the large social media companies are responding with good things, moving all students, as example, to teen Instagram accounts. So no teenager now can have a regular Instagram account. They have to have a teen Instagram account with restrictions and time limits and et cetera, et cetera. New York State PTA, National PTA, as example, has a program called PTA Connected, where we try to educate parents and children together on how to use safe digital and safe online media practices. So we talk with our children more about how we use social media appropriately. Do we think this is tied to social media, the cell phone use? Bob, I see you shaking your head.
Well, I have a guy homesick from school today who's a sixth grader, and I don't need to go into the room he's in right now to know that he's like that, right? So I think, but from my kind of perspective, I think as a policy person, I think the real issue is implementation here, right? I think it's fine to pass a law and it's fine to have a proposal, which I happen to agree with. My son's school district limits pretty much their use of cell phones within the school. And I think district by district, that's been different. I think having a policy statewide, recognizing that New York City is different than Yonkers, which is very different than rural school districts, is another piece of this puzzle that probably has to get worked out in practice.
Yeah, I agree. And Sean, I don't want to put you on the spot, but SED often ends up helping do this implementation. One thing I know that the department has said repeatedly is that local control is very important, right? And I know that many of the stakeholders felt that, having that local control piece. So the law does say that each district has to develop their own policy and what that looks like within kind of a set of parameters. Do we have thoughts on whether we think this is going to make the final budget?
I think my sense, and I would certainly defer to others, but my sense here is that this is a proposal that, maybe there's some tinkering that some folks will want to make around the edges, but that there's broad support to ensuring that districts can create and are supported in creating policies to help students focus on education while they're in school, and to help administrators have some clear guidelines and rules. And I think in many school districts, they're doing this, right? Many districts have gotten ahead of the state in this way, and in a positive way. And they'll just need to look at their policies to make sure that they match with what the strictures are around this goal. But it seems to me that it's a broadly popular proposal, and one that does allow districts some local control in how they implement, where they store the phones, exactly what times they're allowed to access them.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Sean. I was recently at a real schools conference and then a principals conference where the principals in the room had said 70% of them already had some type of cell phone limitation policy. We don't like the term ban because they're not being banned. Parents don't like that word. It is not a ban. So, education and the governor has moved away from that term. It really is a limitation of when the appropriate times you can use your cell phone and for the appropriate uses. As Lethea said, there's a very long list of times that would be appropriate: health, safety, emergencies, medical needs. Appropriate educational uses are still allowed. Interestingly enough, the governor's proposal allows for flip phones. Who had those? We're all dating ourselves. I had a flip phone. So those would actually still be allowed in the proposal. But I think you're right, Sean. Most school districts have something already. What we heard from superintendents that presented, I actually went to that session, was that the ones that had a bell-to-bell limitation. So they really is no, cell phone out at all. It's away, it's in a locker, it's off in a bag, it's in some type of pouch, or it's in a pocket holder. They saw increased academic performance. They saw student engagement. They saw less bullying. They saw less violent incidents in their school buildings. And it was a panel of superintendents and principals that had done this, 2 years ago, and they're seeing really the benefits of that now. They said it was very difficult in the first year, that parents were nervous, and I get it. Our members are nervous. I'm nervous about this. What happens if there's an emergency? Can Jackson get a hold of me? Can I get a hold of Jackson? We speak with law enforcement, and I understand as a first responder, the last thing I want Jackson to ever do if there is an active shooter situation, or if there is a lockdown, or if there's a fire drill, is I don't want him to call me. I want him to listen to his fantastic classroom teacher who's trained to tell him what to do and trained to protect him, unfortunately, in these horrible situations, and trained to evacuate him from a bus or a school building in the safest way. But as a parent, the first thing I want to do is to make sure my child's safe. So it's that balance between that need to stay connected to my child and at the same time know that he is really protected by our fantastic school-related professionals and educators and classroom teachers and instructors in our classrooms. But I think you're right, Sean. I think we're going to get something. I think there's always that tweaks in the language. And I think, PTA's opinion, our kids are going to be better off for it. And we, again, have to model that behavior and continue to have conversations about what that looks like, because, our schools are 8 hours long, and then they are with us or in their home. And how can we have that digital literacy and media literacy conversation surrounding the weekends and the evenings to know that our students are really fully supported? We have, if you can imagine, already gone 50 minutes. So we are at time for questions and answers. I cannot thank you guys enough. I have just one last question for you all. If there is one thing that you are watching that we have not covered in this session, what really is that one thing that's really important to your members or your institution that is on the top of the list? Not foundation aid, not school meals, not cell phones. What else is on that top of the list for you guys?
For us, what we hear from our members and from the parents and families that we work with is really how is the state going to protect immigrant students, and how are the schools and the school districts going to protect immigrant students in New York, and given the federal context we're in. It is, we hear that some of the families that we work with are actually very fearful in sending kids to school now. So that is top of mind for a lot of us.
Thank you for that, Marina. Alethea?
Funding and what happens with Title I. How are things going to be sort of that poison pill tied to the funding that will have to force us to implement things New York doesn't want to do?
I think that's a very valid federal point, Alethea. Bob?
I have a weird one because I heard a lot about it when we were going out and talking to school districts, which is basic bus transportation. And again, the future of electrifying buses sounds simple in practice, is incredibly complicated in reality. And
costly.
Yeah. And the deadlines are really, I think, in many ways unrealistic. So I think it's not as important as some of the other things that were just mentioned, obviously, but it was one that struck me as, how are we going to handle this transition over a period of years?
Thanks, Bob. Sean?
Looking at the Regents state aid proposal, or the Regents proposal generally, the one that I would pick out, and I think all of them are worthy of consideration, is enhanced funding for career and technical education services across New York State. We know that there's demand for it. We know that students benefit from it. And we know that there are ways in which we can fit more students into some of the opportunities that currently exist if the funding is there to support them. And so that's another one.
I think that's great, Sean. And lastly, on immigrant students, Marina brought up a great point. You all brought up fantastic points. On the top story on the New York State PTA website is entitled Support for Immigrant Students. SED Attorney General Tish James and the governor recently in January, in the second week of January, put out a fantastic memo to school district leaders on support for immigrant students in our school districts. You can find that guidance on the top article on the New York State PTA website. You can also find PTA positions on immigrant students and supporting them in our school buildings each and every day. Thank you so much for being in our general session panel. I know we're going to chill. I think it's going to come back on and we're going to take some questions, I think, now.
Yes, we have, I think, a few more kind of comments and contributions than questions. So some of the other issues that are coming to mind for attendees are, right, and you spoke to this, the kind of risk of school violence and school shootings and balancing that need for connection, while ensuring safety. So that did come up. It seemed to resonate.
Agreed. And that, I just want to share, there is a bill that sometimes comes up in the legislature to reduce the number of active shooting drills from 4 to 1, and it's being worked on. Last year, the state education department moved to regulate that all school districts have to move this past September actually, so September 2024, to a more trauma-based method of active shooter drills. So all school districts in New York State had to really revise their active shooting drills to a more trauma-based approach. You can find more information on that on the State Education Department's website or our website or some of the other education websites. If you need more information about that, you can email me anytime, and we're happy to do that. So there is legislation to kind of look at the number of we have. That legislation has not moved forward, I think, while we work on this trauma-informed approach of active shooter drills. And like I said, we are always very blessed in New York that we have not faced that horrific challenge in our school buildings. We know we've had that horrible mass incident at Tops in Buffalo. We will always keep them in our prayers. Chell.
Thank you for sharing that. One question that came up, and you sort of touched on this, but what opportunities do you see for districts being able to interpret and implement the, limitations on cell phones mandates in ways that support the student population? And maybe the second piece I'll add to that is, what are some resources that school districts who might need to be working on these policies could look to?
Does our panel have some thoughts on that?
So I would say, and the way that the law is written, the way in which they collect those internet-enabled devices, and Kyle, thank you for correcting me, because as the law is written, students have to turn in any device that connects to the internet, so you could still have a flip phone.
So I'll be carrying 1980 flip phones around, Alethea.
Better than the pagers. I hated those. So how they collect them, how they store them is subject to discussion. Also, there is a piece in there about the alternative methods for communication. So that is part of what the policies that the school districts will have to figure out. So there is that opportunity there for how they can connect with their students and also with how the items are stored and collected.
And I'll add, and Alethea said the bill mandates that parents have to be informed of how they're going to contact their child. So that is actually written in the draft. And the governor did include $13 million in funding that can be tapped in by school districts for this. But it allows, and even says it allows, no cost. So no district has to spend any funding on this if they don't want to. The bill would allow literally a cell phone to be left in a locker or left in a book backpack so long as it's away and off and, so a district doesn't have to spend funds on this proposal. So that's important for districts to know when they're thinking about how to develop this.
Thank you. We have one final question. We've got a couple of minutes. What funding is allocated in the governor's budget proposal for student mental health? And what might we see action from the legislature on?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Bob or Sean, do you want to chime in on this?
I don't know the specifics on the mental health piece. I know that the governor has proposed, more generically, large increases in mental health funding. I think one of the things that came out of, again, touring the state on this issue was it's great that we're giving mental health funding to the counties, but sometimes that money doesn't reach the school districts. And so I think there was an emphasis by the governor to put more money into that aspect, but I don't know the details.
Thanks, Bob.
I can speak a little bit to that. There were no new initiatives, but the governor did continue a number of grants and programs. There's the primary mental health project. There's some community school funding. There's funding for some school mental health programs and supports. The governor's continued. We know about the Recovs grant that went out a couple of years ago that's supporting school-based centers for this kind of support. I think also, foundation aid is unrestricted aid, right? So districts can use it how they choose, whatever their highest priorities are. And so we know that there are some districts that may take these funds and decide that the best way in which to use these funds would be to hire another school psychologist, right? And so they're allowed to do that, or if they have another priority. And so I think there's a lot of flexibility intended for districts to try and make these choices.
I think that's great. And I'll add on that I want to give a shout out to Commissioner Betty Rosa for all of her work in this space and everything she does to support children. Also, Commissioner Ann Sullivan, who is the Commissioner of the Office of Mental Health. Commissioner Sullivan has dedicated really these past years in expanding school-based mental health clinics and has said repeatedly, even she just was at our convention in November, that any school building that wants a school-based mental health clinic, she will find funding for. So shout out to Commissioner Ann Sullivan. In the budget, there was also another $1.5 million new investment to expand teen mental health first aid training. And that is offered both by the state, and I'll give a shout out to Mahaney's, the Mental Health Association in New York State. My entire governance team has done teen mental health first aid training, youth mental health first aid training. I highly recommend it. It's fantastic. I'm very proud that I'm a youth mental health first aid attendee and graduate. So I really strongly support reaching out to Mahaney's or the state to get that training for you or your team. So I'm excited to see that. There was also $10 million that was new to establish 7 clubhouses and 4 youth safe spaces in New York for youth to really help foster positive relationships with their peers. So we were excited to see that work as well. So as Sean mentioned, some good old money, some good new money, and we'll continue to see those funds flow, hopefully to support every child, their health, wellness, and their mental health, because nothing is more important than that. Ciao. And do we come to our 1 hour, Patrick?
Yeah.
That went exceptionally quick.
Yeah, we did. Thank you, everyone. This was really wonderful. And to hear from a bunch of leading experts in a very busy time of the year, we're super mindful of that. We feel, really appreciative of your time and your insight. And we'll be closely tracking to see if some of the predictions that a lot of you made today come to fruition, whether the budget's on time on April 1st or maybe a few days or so afterwards. Bob probably knows better
Aren't
than I
you
do.
positive, Patrick?
Bob knows better than I do. I'm just throwing it out there. But yeah, I know Chel's been including a lot of information in the links as far as, follow-ups for those looking for CLE credit. We have a host of other programming this spring we'd love for folks to tap into. But really, first and foremost, thank you all for your time and for your energy, and keep up the good fight on the education efforts. It makes a difference. So thank you very much. And Chel, unless you have anything else, I think we're good to wrap up.
That's all for me. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, all. And thanks to my colleagues for all you do every day. And make sure you make a difference each and every day in the life of a child. That's what we in the education community always ask all of you watching. Have a great day.